mean, you should have astronomical margins in these airplanes because you've got to pay back monstrous development costs. And if you're not minting money on a cash basis, something's really wrong.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. Welcome back. I'm Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. With me, as always, Garrick Deschavant of Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who are we talking to today?
Well, good afternoon, Courtney. Thanks for being on for another great episode. So today we have the pleasure of having John Feren. So hopefully many of you will recognize the name. John has got a tremendous background in aviation. So he started off, spent almost 30 years with a couple of little companies that made some airplanes, including McDonnell Douglas and the Boeing company. So, some small names, but nonetheless, they made a few. They made some dents in aviation. But so he was there for almost 30 years. He was also kind of EVP of head of global strategy and development at ACG. So he got the stint on the leasing side. He also spent a little bit of time as a VP of business development for L3 Electronic Systems. And so today he's one of the partners at SplitRock Aviation. He's also received the ISTED Distinguished Achievement Award, and he was actually a graduate, so he got a bachelor's degree from UC Irvine in Information and Computer Science, as well as an MBA from UC Irvine as well. So it should be a really good discussion today. So John, this is your time on wing.
Just a quick intermission before we continue with the show. We do get a lot of questions about how our listeners can support the show, and frankly, the easiest way is to continue the spirit of the show, which is just to reach out to us at conferences. But we also run businesses as well, and you can support us by supporting a lot of the work that we do. You can support the work that I do through Visual Approach by visiting visualapproach.io, where we produce a lot of research and analysis, a lot of data visualizations. From
my side, obviously, I focus more on metals, so anything that's aircraft related, if you're looking for valuations, whether it's on aircraft engines, I'm happy to help with any of those types of projects. So we appreciate, certainly the opportunities to work with all of you. And we certainly also appreciate just the fact that people are willing to listen to what we have to say and enjoy kind of our thoughts and takes on what we think is a fascinating industry. So thank you.
Okay, back to the show.
Well, so John, thank you very much for being on the podcast with us today. And so I don't know if you've had a chance to kind of listen to some of the previous podcasts that we've done. You'll know that, we kind of like to get a sense from our guests in terms of how they got involved in aviation, where the passion came from. You've obviously done quite a few things in aviation, so we'd love to hear from you in terms of how you got your start. Where did the passion came from on your side?
Well, it's very kind to be here, and I really appreciate, Courtney and Garrick, your kind invite. One of my friends, Ron Anderson, previously recorded one of your podcasts, and I listened and learned quite a bit from it. So it was informative. The question how I got started in aviation is kind of an interesting story. I was working in a research lab at the University of California, and we were studying urban mass transportation. And the school got a request to have someone show up for a job interview. And I told the school, I don't think I was really interested. And they said, you do not understand. When we get offers for jobs, we send bodies. We don't care whether you get the job, but you got to show up. And so I dutifully showed up in July. One of my alma mater that I didn't realize was working at Douglas Aircraft in the economic research department, and he thought it'd be cool to see if anybody from UC Irvine would show up for a job. And the gentleman that ran the group was a French economist, brilliant man, but not always available. And so I did okay, I guess, in the interview. And they called me back in December to meet this French economist. And he immediately grilled me on economics like I've never been grilled before. I doubt I passed the test, but he wanted to do a regression analysis on a laptop computer. And I also was studying information computer science at the time. So I aced the computer science part of the test, but I flunked the economics part of the test. and he wanted to hire me as his computer monkey because he was having trouble getting assistants at the time. So I was offered the job, which I turned down because I was writing a research paper at the University of California. And it was vastly more important to publish a study on dial-a-rides than it was to get a full-paid job. And my boss at the university said, you need to leave. These jobs are not for lifetime. We really need another person to come into your job. So you're taking this job. So I called him back and I said, the offer is still there. I'll take it. And they said, really nice. And they said, well, you'd start tomorrow, like December 21st. And we close between Christmas and New Year's. So you're going to get a week's pay by starting December 26th or December 22nd. Not being a very good economist, I said, no. I still have to finish this research report. I can't start till the end of January. And they thought I was dumber than dirt, but they still let me start. And I'm not certain I was ever rewarded for finishing the research report on dial-a-ride vehicles, but it certainly was a good lesson.
Wow. Yeah, sometimes when you're younger, you just don't quite get it. When people tell you things, you're like,
no,
no,
long-winded story.
No, that's great. That's a great story. So obviously that's how you got into kind of doing some stuff for Douglas. Right, and then what happened from there?
The early days of OEMs providing analytical work for the airlines, and we had fleet planning tools that were much more sophisticated in the airlines because you could run mainframe computers at Boeing or Airbus and McDonnell Douglas, where many airlines couldn't afford to have these tools or capabilities. So you could do system optimization runs. Now you could do them in 9 seconds. It would take quite a bit of mainframe time to do them back in the days if the route networks had any complexity. And added to the fleet optimization were individual city pair forecasts. Added to that was what the macroeconomic outlook was. And so you kind of prepared an entire business plan, if you will, for the airline if you were to buy the McDonnell Douglas products, and Boeing, I'm sure, was doing the same. And so it was a great opportunity to learn a lot about airlines and learn about macro tools that really would go into their planning process.
What aircraft were you hawking at this point in time?
So at that time, McDonnell Douglas had the MD-80 and the DC-10 before the launch of the MD-11. The DC-930 had kind of ceased production, and the DC-8 was out of production. We were a pretty fragile player compared to Boeing at the time. I'm guessing our market share was probably like 30%. And certainly if you did on dollar value, it will be below 20% compared to 747s and the 767 that the Boeing was selling. But it was, it was kind of a duopoly. Airbus was just in the early days of going with the A300 and the A310. And they were very much spheres of political interest. So where the European flag carried a lot of influence, Airbus did pretty well. They were pretty fragile in the U.S. with Eastern Airlines, which nobody can even remember Eastern Airlines anymore. I think did a try-it-you-like-it deal with the A300. But they really weren't mainstream. But they certainly were coming on, and they later had success with the product line, and certainly the launch of the A320 changed the whole trajectory for Airbus. It was a game changer. They really got that design right, despite some early difficulties. But everybody that's launched an airplane program usually stumbles in the beginning for one reason or another.
Yeah, yeah, or later on too, even after building many airplanes, right?
It's not the plan, but it can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So how many years were you kind of quote unquote with Douglas before? I guess were you there when ultimately kind of Boeing or trying to think, how did that work? The McDonnell Douglas ultimately ended up helping Boeing buy themselves. Is that how that worked?
That's certainly how the press reports it. I'm not certain that Phil Condit would necessarily describe it that way, but there was a merger between McDonnell Douglas and Boeing. Theoretically a merger of equals, but a number of the McDonnell Douglas executives had pretty lofty positions after a while. Some of that happenstance. I'm not certain it was designed at the time. That was in 1997. And I started with McDonnell Douglas in 1978. So I'd been there almost 20 years at the time of the merger.
Okay, wow.
Boeing was very circumspect about the marketing talent at McDonnell Douglas. And so most of the senior jobs went to a Boeing person. I was fortunate enough to be assigned to work with a gentleman by the name of John Hayhurst, who was running US, Canada, Latin America, and the leasing companies. And he was a very welcoming guy. And it was the most extraordinary experience. I mean, people that you tried to have conversations with as a McDonnell Douglas guy, very difficult. The first day there, I called up and I said, I'm John Feren for Boeing. And they go, we'll put you right through, sir. So I said, okay, it's an
I
accident.
knew
So
it.
I called up the next customer. Every customer you called, you immediately got your phone calls taken. I go, heck, anybody could sell airplanes. They'll take your friggin' phone calls.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just a world of difference. And so, for the people that are working for aspiring OEMs, the advantage that Airbus and Boeing have with the depth of relationships and the credibility is almost impossible to quantify. But it's a major benefit that they have in their side.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So
We
now
had we
from
had the
from 19. Oh, sorry. Go
so
ahead.
we
Go
had
ahead.
the very same. Well, I guess the opposite interaction with some people who came from Airbus to Bombardier, and what they said was, why aren't these people picking up the phone? They used to pick up the phone for me all the time. Like, I know, right? It's not that easy.
Courtney, I thought about that a fair amount, and it's a great observation. And I don't think that the customers are mean or not fair and balanced, but they have also convinced their management teams and convinced their boards that they're really going with the right horse. And you're in a relationship that could last 20 years. As Garrick pointed out, things could go wrong later on. And so the depth of resources that's embedded within that OEM is a very important ingredient to their decision
Of course.
process. And so if you think you've got a fragile supplier, do you really want to spend a lot of time with them when you don't think you're going to be able to get the board approval, or you're not going to be able to get the pilots on board? And so the moniker of the incumbent with an established brand is a very powerful influence in a lot of these decisions. That everybody wants to tell you they competed on price, but I would wager that 50% of the competitions get decided on factors other than the net price. The price is so close, they can go either way, but they really like aspects of the proposal. They like the relationship. They like the ability to make other changes in the purchase agreement. And so I doubt you're going to find it's down to the last penny on price and everything else is ignored. The brand, the credibility, the flexibility they have all enter into that decision. And, being the incumbent really matters.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of based on that experience, we always kind of looked at price, and I think this is appropriate. Price was the tiebreaker, because if you used price as a lever, then you're a commodity. You will just move to the lowest price. But regarding the incumbency, absolutely. Which, by the way, I mean, I jest. It's been years now since I've tried to hawk airplanes at Bombardier, but we were the big guys at the regional players, right? So I mean, we certainly saw both sides. But think of the situation, Bob Jordan at Southwest. If Bob Jordan buys more Boeing airplanes, nobody on the board is going to say, "Well, Bob, you bought Boeing airplanes and things went south." No, I mean he's secure in that decision because it's a continued decision. I'll use Interjet as kind of the other end of that spectrum, where Interjet brings on, and we're heavily incentivized to bring on the Superjet, and it still did not go well. And well, all eyes were on the people who made that decision to step outside the box, outside the commonality. It's a real thing. It's there's no right or wrong. It's value for sure to the airlines.
Well, I think a great example of that, Courtney, is look at the successes of the A220 under the auspices of Airbus. I mean, they didn't redesign the wing, they didn't redesign the cockpit, they didn't change the flying characteristics. And all of a sudden, this airplane that was kind of struggling for market presence is now have people in hand-to-hand combat for the delivery positions. And it went from being a nice airplane to a really hot airplane. And I think that Airbus standing behind it Certainly the sales of the A320neo and the MAX, where there isn't a lot of availability, probably played a little bit into the upswing that Bombardier wasn't quite able to enjoy because neither product was quite sold out at the time they did that transition. But just wrapping the Airbus moniker around the A220 made it a whole different sales proposition. And you mentioned Bob Jordan. I think of a funny story. My sales director, incredible lady named Derek, comes in one day and says, we want to make this change for Southwest. They've asked for it. And she goes, I'm going to have to go get some approvals. And I said, just do it. And she said, well, we don't have approval. I said, well, we're not going to get fired for giving approval. We're going to get fired if we lose Southwest as a customer. Just do it.
Yeah.
That's very true.
Yeah, that's very true.
Well, I think the flip side to that brand name, there are a lot of deals that have a lot of course, stories behind them as it shifted over to Airbus. But I think the flip side of that is I don't necessarily agree with the idea that the E2 and Embraer can't be successful without Boeing. And it kind of works along the same lines. I think they can be.
It's not an on-off switch.
Right. And I kind of felt, maybe still kind of feel that is used a little bit as a crutch. Get out and sell, right? And they are. They're doing their thing, but it's a good airplane. They're going to need to do what they need to do. I think it's just as likely that Boeing saw it, if they had the airplane, that they're like, we just want to sell the big stuff anyway. Airbus didn't do that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Having a partner is also, in that instance, adding a partner. So Airbus adding, say, the A220 was probably equally as important as the A220 or the C series at the time losing the top competitor. That had a lot. Airbus was no longer competing against that aircraft. That was also that was always the hardest group to compete against as well.
Courtney, you're much closer to this than I am. But one of the observations that I kind of scratch my head about is, Airbus bought this for €1 or a Canadian dollar or some de minimis amount, and yet they still printed losses. And I think it really talks to the strength of the leverage that Bombardier had to get the competitive pricing, that it really wasn't as able to drive the supply chain to give them the same dollars per pound or dollars per passenger or dollars per ASM that you would see at Boeing or Airbus. Now, those two had scale, so they're taking a lot more units and spreading their fixed costs over them. That gives them an advantage. But I think it's very difficult for the third producer. Now, maybe China will break all the rules and have the same level of pricing. I mean, you should have astronomical margins in these airplanes because you've got to pay back monstrous development costs. And if you're not minting money on a cash basis, something's really wrong. And I think that was a struggle that Bombardier faced, is they just didn't have enough margin in the product. And they were kind of capped from how much they could charge for the product because there were bigger products above them. And so you can get a little bit of a dollars per passenger benefit, but you can only get so much before the guy goes, look, for that price, I'll just get a Max or I'll just get a Neo.
Listen, John, if you've got time to list all the problems, like I'll go one by one. But this is fascinating because I was not on the supply chain side. I did not negotiate any of those agreements. I was purely on the sales side. But what you're talking about is real, and those are real challenges. But I don't think it's necessarily that the smaller guys are yes, they're in a disadvantaged position, but I think it's because the big guys are in such a they are the Walmarts of the supply chain world on that side. And by that, I mean, they could turn entire companies off by discontinuing a supply chain agreement. Like, they could just end that company. They're that big. Certainly Bombardier was not. Certainly Embraer is not. And then, all the other aircraft, just component manufacturers in that. But that, you're not wrong. I mean, that leverage is outsized. I mean, it's it's incredible. And what's really interesting now is to watch GE, Pratt, and Rolls push back against that kind of in recent times.
I don't think you were in attendance. There was a Deutsche Bank conference earlier this fall in September,
Yeah,
and
I was there. Yeah.
and Gus Kelly was on stage, and Gus made a comment that there's a built-in speed brake in the system where Pratt and GE in particular want to harvest a fair amount of aftermarket engine overhauls on their V2500s and on their CFM56s. And if they go to astronomical production rates to satisfy Airbus or Boeing, they may obsolete their own business and not get the overhauls that they book for. And as you know, they sell the engines at massive discounts up front to be able to get 2, 3, 4 engine overhauls later. And if you went to super high production rates, and instead of getting 4 engine overhauls, they got 3, or instead of 3, they got 2, it would fundamentally negatively impact their businesses. So his thesis is, even though there's some risk of overproduction, the engine guys are going to put a governor on keeping that in balance because it'll otherwise destroy their business models. I don't know if it's all that quite simple, but it was an interesting observation from a fairly smart player in the industry.
Yeah, well, especially since there's always been that chat about overproduction, right? It seems like with each cycle, right, there is that discussion of like everybody's concerned about overproduction and when is it going to happen. So I think a comment like that is definitely interesting from the audience standpoint, from investor standpoint, to kind of hear that, like, look, yeah, you have the guys that supply the engines that would normally, well, you would think normally, well, if this allows them to sell more engines when they want to do that. But when you look at I think the amount of capital that they've had to spend and the headaches that they've had in trying to produce a product that satisfies the market, you could definitely understand, like, well, let's bring it back a little bit. Let's let the older stuff kind of go to shop and let us sell parts. Let us sell our services for a little bit longer, which I think is going to work out in the end just based on kind of what's going on in the market today. But it's definitely an interesting point that from a lessor to kind of bring that up to everybody to kind of say, hey, look, yeah, you know what, that's why we're not as concerned, which is a great point in today's environment.
Yeah, and Courtney, circling back on Bombardier, I don't mean to imply that they weren't efficient or they didn't produce as good of products as they could have, but I think they just got themselves in a position where the commercial entry point was going to be painful for a long period of time. I mean, they've made millions selling business jet and private aircraft, and very successful at that. So I think it's very logical that they would be commercially savvy on how to build commercial airplanes. But if you can't get to scale quickly, you just get bounded on what you can really do. And, one of the interesting ones to watch right now is the folks at Jet Zero, who have this concept. I'd be interested on your views, Garrick, as a certified appraiser, and Courtney is a pretty good student of passenger O&D flows.
As a friend of Garrick, you can say it.
Blended wing body aircraft.
Yeah.
And I kind of think of it a little bit in the Tesla lexicon, where here's a disruptor that's coming in with a fairly bold difference in energy consumption, on paper 50% less fuel consumption. Blended wing is not a physics or an aerodynamics issue that people challenge. It's been around for a long time, and it's certainly a very efficient aerodynamic design. Whether you can produce it and build it for a reasonable cost remains to be seen. But I'd be curious on your thoughts if you think there's a play for a disruptor in the space that comes along and does something pretty bold and different.
Yeah, I mean, look, absolutely, right? I think that's what the industry is kind of meant to do, right? At some point, you will have somebody that comes in and disrupts the market with a new product that basically innovates, right? I mean, that's what our industry does. We innovate over and over again, just because ultimately that's what I think people want to see, and that's whether it's from a emission standpoint, whether it's from an efficiency standpoint, whether it's just, well, now we can add more passengers on an airplane because we figured out a way to make, really skinny seats, or people stand up, or, there's always this amount of innovation. I think that's just kind of the next step. From that standpoint, I think it's a matter of when is the right time to be able to implement it so that it actually does what they say it's supposed to do. And then I think the big piece to that, which it's funny, I was talking to the engine OEMs at the Airline Economics conference, a few weeks ago when we were there. And, we were talking about kind of the next steps and what the next generation of aircraft would look like. And, one of the big points that I tried to make was, look, I think it's one thing to have, this great new product that you're going to be able to offer, but will the infrastructure also be there, right? Because I think that's a big, and are the airlines ready for that? Are the airlines ready for a new, architecture to come in and, kind of be a game changer? But there is everything else that's tied behind that in terms of how do you get people on? Are the airports able to manage that? And I think that's a big piece of it. So I think it's kind of there is a bit more to, do we think that there is kind of a somebody that comes in as a game changer, will they be successful? I think they could be, depending on how the rest of the industry reacts, and are they prepared for that kind of a change? And is a company like JetZero having those discussions with airports, with, not only the airlines, but the airports and all the other providers to be able to say, yep, we can definitely take this airplane on and it will be a game changer. And that should be the way that the industry goes.
Yeah, think about it. So I love God, I knew I was going to have a fascinating conversation with you, John. It never not happens. But I still think back to the engine OEMs, and I think they are very important in this context of what's next, because your point on, or Garrick's point on, they make money during the overhauls, they lose money for every new engine that goes out the door on a new aircraft, right? That's the way that business model is, and yet basically the entirety of the latest generation of aircraft came from the engines. Like, we're still flying 707 fuselages around, right, on the Max, on the 737 Max, and the latest generation came from the engines. I think the next generation does not come from propulsion. It does not come from, I don't even think the fuel source is much. I think that can be moved in. I think it comes from, like you were suggesting, the aerodynamics. Blended wing body is really, really interesting. That is how you fundamentally change the fuel burn profile of the aircraft that can do what we need them to do today. I love the idea of electric, hydrogen, great. But listen, the problems that you start listing on those on that challenge list is they're incredibly long. And blended wing body, it's still a long list, but it's doable. It's within the physics of today. We don't need an entirely new power source. We're not waiting on these new batteries to produce electric or this new cryo system to produce hydrogen. If you took a blended wing body and you married, say, an open rotor on that, I mean, we're talking, I don't know, I'm going to make up numbers, 30%, 35% fuel burn efficiencies. We just built new airplanes for 15%. So that's huge. Like that, I'm actually quite bullish about the prospect of these new designs. Like bring the efficiencies of the aircraft back into the aircraft design rather than just the engine design, because I think the engine OEMs have kind of had it too.
So one of the areas I'd be curious to get your views on is innovation. I was talking to one of the largest U.S. airline CEOs, and I said, you have recovered nearly 100% of your flights by 2023 from where the depth of you shut the airline down and you were furloughing people, and it was a very difficult problem. And yet for Boeing and Airbus, it's been quite a challenge to get back to 80% or 90% of what their peaks were. And so is it that much fundamentally harder to build an airplane factory back up than it is an airline? He laughed. He said, of course not, because they're in a duopoly. They have no incentive to do this. If I didn't immediately spool back up, my passengers would go to my competitors. I'm not in a duopoly. And I thought, it's probably a little tongue-in-cheek of being an exaggeration, but probably not that far off. And so when you think about innovation, what's going to cause Boeing or Airbus to break the duopoly, if you will, and innovate? Because, if we don't spend money, they're not going to spend money. But if we decide to spend a whole bunch of money to build a new single aisle airplane, or we decide to spend our money to build a new wide body airplane, the other guy's probably going to match us, and are we really going to get a commensurate share for doing this? So riding the horse you're on, and today Boeing's what $40 billion in debt from
Mhm.
what they've gone through. Some of it self-inflicted, they would admit. It's pretty unlikely that they want to press the go fast button when you're in that position. You really need to get rates of the 737 Max up to 50 a month, and some of the Wall Street analysts expect them to have $10 million in cash flow per airplane on the 737s. And so the last thing you want to do is accelerate the demise of, mending money. And, some estimates they could have $10 billion of free cash flow a year to start paying down that debt. But the debt probably doesn't get down to the levels where you want to do an all new airplane until 2027, 28, 29. And so I think you're hearing from their executives that we'd love to do this, but we've got other priorities, and certainly it requires the engine companies to be in concert with them, because if you can design an all new
Mhm.
airplane, but if you don't get a commensurate improvement in the propulsion system, you're going to leave a lot of opportunity on the table for the guy that comes second. But it'll be an interesting journey to see who decides to break first and do something. Today the numbers would tell you Boeing should be the company that breaks first, but I'm not certain. Back in 2003, when we decided to do the 77, the numbers would have told you that that was the time for Boeing to break first. It just happened to be when we felt the technology was mature enough and we were in a position to actually deliver on that. So I think it's kind of a combination of factors that goes into that kind of decision.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
it's really interesting. But is 28? That's only 5 years from now. That's almost four now. In the grand scheme of aircraft programs, by the way, I agree wholly with kind of that that idea and that time frame. But that's 4 years for a launch program. I think you laid out well basically the reasoning why the NMA failed. Like, we don't need another airplane with the current technology. What they need is the next step. Can that step come in 28? That timing seems to be pretty good. If we're talking technologies like blended wing body, again, that's a huge step. I'm not underlying, yes, it's physically possible. It's the manufacturing challenge, it's the infrastructure challenge. It does kind of line up. Is it Boeing or Airbus that moves first? I don't know. I mean, I'm not all that bullish on Airbus either, right? I mean, they're fat, dumb, and happy as well. Just making, I'm sure if Boeing's making or could make 10 million per airplane, Airbus is probably 15. I don't know what the number is.
Yeah, I
Um,
only pick the Boeing numbers because they tend to be reported on a little more widely here. But
yeah,
Airbus's profitability per airplane is either on par, or maybe even a little better, because they're at a higher volume rate.
yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
But I will say though that the factor. So kind of back to the original C series, and one of the biggest challenges we had. Not don't know that we recognize it, but in retrospect, I think one of the most effective competitive moves against the new entrant was increasing production purely. If you have airplanes that you can push out the door, it takes away any delivery advantage that inevitably just spills to the second or third carrier. And if you control that, you can drown out whatever's left. And remember, you're talking about Boeing you're getting to 50 a month on production. They were at 57 in what, 2018?
Yeah.
Airbus was at, what did they hit 65? I
I
can't
think
remember.
62. I think it was
62.
60,
And what are they now? They're in
62,
the
yeah.
50s, right?
They're trying to get to the 50s. I think they're trying to get to 52, right?
But John,
So, but it's
your
definitely,
point is
yeah.
wholly valid.
So,
I think the
guys,
question
what's
is why.
the collective wisdom on the journey to net zero, progress on those goals by 2030, and progress on the carbon neutral by 2050? Um, there's a lot of mixed signals. Exxon made a major $60 billion acquisition for a fossil fuel property. I think it's called Pioneer Solutions. I may have the name wrong exactly. They're competitor made an equally large investment, basically saying we live in the real world. Fossil fuels are going to be important for quite a while, and we can afford to spend this kind of money and make a decent return for ourselves and for our shareholders. You've got CalPERS and KKR coming out over the weekend and saying, we're going to start discriminating on our investments unless they're targeted to carbon reduction and a fairly keen attention to the environment. Um, I don't know how many of your listeners are football fans, but if you were watching football over the weekend, you might have seen a Delta Airlines commercial that talked about sustainability. And to advertise on an NFL game is probably a $600,000 to $1 million proposition for a minute. And I suspect Delta knows what they're doing. So it must be important to their customers to spend that kind of money to tell that kind of story. So you've got big oil saying, I don't know what you guys are thinking, but the world's going to look a lot like it does today, decade from now. And yet you've got, major funders of business and enterprise saying, I'm going to pay attention to this. And you've got one of the largest airlines saying, it's really important to us. So how does this all sort out?
Yeah.
Any
I mean,
717s
I
are still
think
flying?
there's, yeah, yeah. There is that fine line between, what's a PR move to kind of show, look, our
It's $1 million
shareholders
PR
and
move. I mean,
oh, absolutely. And it's, I mean, um, so from that standpoint, it's kind of, you have to show that you are making the initiatives, you're spending the money, you do care. But I don't know if there's any one move that takes care of the environment. It's, I think people kind of tend to look for one solution. And at the end of the day, I think it's everyone everywhere needs to do something, right? It can't just be one. It's not going to be fuels that that save the environment. It's not going to be emissions that save the environment. It's just a combination of everything. And I think what people forget and what they don't necessarily pay attention to is from the airline side, right? If you think about the industry overall, gets more efficient every year, right? Because of the innovation and the money that's put into, the engine side, the airframe side, the materials that are used, everything. But I think that's forgotten very quickly when people are like, oh yeah, but you're polluting. And, it's kind of like, that's like, you have the flight shaming and, how dare you, kind of emit carbon by traveling, to somewhere and visiting another world. But at the end of the day, the industry, it's not like the industry does nothing where they're just kind of like, you know what, we're going to keep using our 1985, 737-300 because it works. Why do we need to change it? No, I mean, there's billions of dollars spent on basically making our industry more efficient. Now, I think, and it's a point that Courtney's made several times as from the time that I've known him. Problem with our industry is that we tend to grow into the efficiencies, right? As we get more efficient, the industry grows as well, and so we ultimately end up just doing more of what we're doing, just more efficiently. But there's still more of it. We're still growing, right? And so from Courtney's point, right, of hey, if we don't want to, if we want to become more efficient, we want to emit less carbon, well, we need to fly less, right? Or you need to stop flying altogether. But I don't think anybody wants to do that, right? That's not the point of globalization, right? That's not where ultimately we interact as a world, and we ultimately kind of go into where everybody's on board to kind of basically keep the planet green longer than where it was before. So I think but I don't know. I think it's a bit forgotten in terms of, I think people quickly go to aviation because it's easy to do, but they don't realize ultimately all of the money that's, I think, being spent on becoming more efficient. Because at the end of the day, that's what everybody's trying to do.
Yeah, I'm kind of a believer that we're on this journey, that there's no single solution that gets us there. And we need to think broad, that, if we went in and reduced all the carbon out of aviation with some magic bullet, it still wouldn't change the overall equation, because aviation contributes 2.5%, 4. I mean, you can slice and dice it, but it's a pretty small number in aggregate. And that's not to exonerate us from, in any way, shape, or form, from doing our part. But I think FedEx and Yale University have partnered together to look at ways to invest money to reduce carbon on a global basis, not necessarily tied to aviation. It could be part of aviation, but it could be
Yeah.
in other fields. Because at the end of the day, reducing carbon, if you can spend $100 million and make a 6% impact in some other industry, why
Yes.
wouldn't you do that rather than spend $4.9 trillion and make a smaller impact? I mean, this is getting bang for your buck. And so I think that's the mantra that we all want to be on, is we should contribute to a solution. And it may be in our field or it may be in another field. It doesn't get us out of having to spend money, and doesn't have us not paying for the carbon we produce. But let's deploy those investments to the areas where we'll get the biggest return for the aggregate industry.
If an airline was really serious, well, they are serious. It's not that they're not serious about reducing carbon. But if an airline really wanted to reduce carbon, they would go buy a coal power plant and turn it off. That is dollar for dollar. And there are other examples, but dollar for dollar, that is the best way to spend money to reduce carbon. Carbon is carbon is carbon.
You study O&D flows as much as anyone in the business. If you look at the financial results in the third quarter of what is kind of affectionately known as the ULCCs or the LCCs in the U.S., somewhat disappointing. If you look at the equivalent counterparts in Europe, Ryanair, Wizz, EasyJet, they did pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the backdrop in Europe, France is saying everybody should take the train. Nobody should fly a domestic flight in France. And yet, the average stage length of Ryanair and EasyJet and Wizz has got to be probably under 2 hours, maybe an hour 45 or something like that. So they're flying effectively short-haul flights. And short-haul flights probably have the least impact on CO2. It's all the long-haul flights. But everybody wants to go after the short-haul flights. But why are the European low-cost airlines seeming to thrive, where the U.S. low-cost airlines seem to be really bollocksed up right now?
Just capacity. The U.S. went nuts after COVID. The backlogs are full of U.S. deliveries, and they're taking them. The U.S. is up, 16-17% year over year in capacity. Europe is having its 2022 moment right now. So last year we would have been saying the opposite about the US, because last year we saw the recovery in the US. Fares went crazy because the recovery was faster than we could actually service it. So then we're like, oh, well, then we need a bunch of airplanes. They take a bunch of airplanes, they overshoot. It's what we do. Europe hasn't done that yet. I don't know that Europe will be able to overshoot because of the deliveries and supply chain, and the US controls the order books. But I think more to the point you're talking about, the European traveler continues to show up at the door of these dirty airplanes and create in economical business a carbon emitting business. And this is where that objective look back, why Exxon is investing in this space, because KKR indirectly said they're not going to. They made that dirty investment more valuable. And Exxon said, okay, we'll take the free money. Thank you very much. There will always be somebody to step in unless you prevent that person from stepping in. Same with the ULCCs in Europe. If you, and I think flight shaming did actually do a little bit of this. If you're preventing people from choosing to do that, and that's kind of through social pressure, then it will have an impact. Now, it has other social impacts as well that don't really get considered. There's no easy answer. I don't have one. I just kind of talk through all the conflicting thoughts I have in my head. But I should point out, I live in Texas, so.
Yes, you live in Texas. That's right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think also when you. Here. Yeah, cause that's right. Yeah, just in your backyard, right? You do oil shots at the end of the day. Is that what you do? I mean, I think the other part with Europe as well, which is kind of why we're not necessarily seeing the same phenomenon that we've been seeing in the U.S., is right. They didn't have a pilot problem, right? They didn't have this this pressure to all of a sudden upgauge airplanes because they didn't have enough pilots to be able to fill those routes, right? So it's a bit of a different. I think it's part of the difference from what I see as compared to the U.S. And so they didn't necessarily have to go out and place orders for bigger airplanes to be able to handle a problem that they were having, at the time, right? And that they're still having in the U.S. I think that's still an issue, and that we'll continue to see that trend in terms of kind of upgauging. And Courtney did a great piece on that this week in terms of kind of showing how the pilot shortage is gonna kind of stay with us for some time. But so I think to me that's kind of my view on that in terms of why Europe's doing better is because they didn't have the same issues that the U.S. has had. And so I think they were able to handle it a little bit differently. I don't know if that means that they will not have the same issues going forward. If you're saying, Gordon, kind of like Europe is kind of where the U.S. was in 2022. I don't know if that means that next year they'll be where we are today. I don't know. I don't know if that works that way.
So one theory I have for you, and it's not backed up with any scientific analysis.
Those are the best ones.
But if you take United Airlines, they've got a hub in San Francisco, they've got a hub in Denver, they've got a hub in Chicago, they've got a hub in Houston, they've got a hub in Washington, D.C. So they've got 5 hubs that they draw passengers from across the country. If you look at KLM, Air France, they practically have 2 hubs, Amsterdam and CDG, that they draw passengers from. And I think it sets them up to be almost disinterested in local O&D between Lyon and Marseille. It's like, who cares? Mm-hmm. Where because of the nature of the hubs, and Delta, has their hubs sprinkled across the United States, and certainly Southwest, has kind of invented the idea of flying to where people want to go rather than forcing them through a hub, that you see more competition, if you will, on the routes. So I don't think Ryanair goes head-to-head against Lufthansa and Air France and Iberia to the extent that Spirit would go head-to-head with Delta or American, or pick your favorite airline. And so I think the nature of the way the competition unfolds in Europe is different. I don't know that I can back that up with facts and data, but it's just kind of an intuitive feel I have about it, that they kind of fly from somewhere to nowhere in Europe. And in those markets, you don't see the big airlines. But in the U.S., it's a hub, it's a spoke. So it's a one connection, and you get your miles and you get more frequency. And so even though it's convenient to fly from Milwaukee to Oklahoma City on Allegiant, 3 times a week, you can get there 7 times a day going through a hub, and you wind up using the bigger airline because of the schedule flexibility. Even though the direct flight would have been what you prefer, it just doesn't have the availability that you need on the day of the week or time of day you're looking for.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything structurally broken in the U.S. They just overshot, as we do. Both being Americans and airlines, it's kind of like the double overshoot. So they'll respond. I'm more interested in the response. How do the ULCCs change? The international recovery was this summer. We had our 2022 international recovery in 2023. So next year, the year-over-year comps are going to be abysmal compared to what they were this year. It sounds so silly, but something as simple as that metric really screws up internal departments and accounting and just creates different decisions. I think we'll just see kind of more of that. Just, if there's one thing that is constant in this industry, it's change, and they will absolutely continue to do that. But I love your kind of analogy to Europe. I mean, kind of more on the ESG space. How do you look at the future? Your collective years of experience, 3 or 4 of them. How do you see ESG playing out? Kind of in that European perspective.
Great question. I think Derek would be uh,
I already know what he's going to
I
say.
think the world is starting
As
to change,
Mhm.
and hopefully in a positive way. I mean, we have unfortunate activities going on in the Middle East and Gaza, which, is just horrific on so many levels. Um, the whatever the fancy words that the Russians use for whatever they're doing in Ukraine, it's a military adventure or something like that. That's now gone on to day 500 or something like that. Um, but if you can, you know, get past those events, I think international traffic is coming back. The Chinese have been requesting more and more direct flights to the U.S. The U.S. airlines have been kind of haltingly going along with this because they're not able to overfly Russia the way the Chinese are, and so they kind of see it as a share grab if the Chinese can fly, shorter routes and they're able to cross over Russia and the U.S. skies have to go around it. But putting that aside, I think it bodes well that there be more travel out of China. I think the last segment to really respond after the shutdowns has been international travel out of China, which was a real big engine for the industry. And I think Garrick, you said it earlier. I think travel brings us all closer together. And one of the over looming geopolitical concerns is what happens out in Asia, specifically in Taiwan, and what China may or may not do, and how the U.S. may or may not respond. And I'm always a believer that the best interests of China are served with peace and negotiation, and they play a long game. And so I would be the camp that China will not do anything precipitous. So if we don't egg them on to do something, they're not going to just they got look how they acquired Hong Kong. They demonstrated enormous patience to get Hong Kong, and it finally happened on terms they could live with, and they really didn't have a clock in play. And so I don't know what that means for Taiwan, but I think it's more likely than not that they'll be deliberate and they'll be unrelenting on their view. But I don't think they're going to start something that would have horrific consequences. Um, when you look at Gaza, what's gone on there, I'm not certain what's left when you finally, put the peace flags up and everybody gets to be friends. I mean, most of the buildings have been knocked down. I mean, this is war is an ugly, brutal, horrific thing, and so I got to believe that we'll find a way to avoid that out in Asia. That's certainly my belief. But there has been a lot of decoupling that's been gone on, and corporate America has asked their companies, what's your backup plan if you can't get your iPhones all done in China? At one point, I think Apple was reported to have like 98% of all their iPhones finished in China. So I think over time, Apple's migrated from a rotation from China to India. And I think you're seeing that with a number of the other OEM suppliers is kind of rotating at least a second source from China to someplace else. Um, and that's probably not bad. I mean, having second sources has multiple benefits to it. Um, but I think you're going to find a lot more challenge of airlines making prosperity. Fuel prices are likely to stay high. Pilot wages and flight attendant wages and mechanic wages have all upticked after the pandemic and probably faster than airline revenues. So there'll be a cost shift to labor. Um, there isn't anybody that's discounting MROs. Garrett, you guys follow the engine maintenance costs, and they're sky high, and they're likely to stay there. So the profitability equation for the airlines, I think, is going to be very challenging as they move through 24 and 25, and whether they'll even be able to make a profit. Willie Walsh, the director general of IATA, is kind of famous for giving a speech that if you take the entire airline profits and you spread them out per passenger, it's less than a one-way subway ticket in New York. I think they average like $2.64 a profit, and it costs you $2.75 to take a one-way subway ride.
yeah,
So it's not a business with enormous amounts of margin in it. And as those costs go up, and there's historically the industry's been fairly elastic. So if you raise prices, you get disproportionate response in demand. So I think pent up demand changed the elasticity on a temporary basis, but my view is longer term, travel's still elastic.
So you brought up India, which I think is an interesting market to maybe touch on a little bit. Um, it seems to be an area that everybody kind of is looking at as the next growth area for the industry. I'd love to
500
get
airplanes
your
on order at Air India, probably the same number at Indigo. I'd
yeah. I
say
mean
so.
they've got I think they've got the I think one of the largest market shares of the backlogs of some of the OEMs aside from United, so and Southwest. But I'd love to get your take on kind of what do you think maybe some of the the words of caution in terms of, because it seems like everybody is willing to go into the area, but it's not a no-brainer, right? There's definitely challenges with India, whether it be trying to take airplanes out when there is a default situation, or whether it's also the environment that's harsh on aircraft performance, right? So there's a lot of things that are going on, but I don't know, with obviously with kind of what you guys do today at SplitRock, if that's something that how do you advise your clients in terms of when you look at that area and areas of opportunity, how do you look at it?
Well, the market's so large and has so much potential, you can't afford not to look at it. I think if you go back in the annals of OEM forecasts in 1991 or 1995 or 2003, or pick your year, they've always been wildly optimistic about what was going to happen versus what ultimately happens. Um, Unlike China, which is a fairly disciplined, well organized, well controlled market, India is kind of like the wild, wild west. And even though you think they're a signature to Cape Town, they're not really a signature to Cape Town, because a local
Right.
judge can decide it's okay for them to loot your airplane and take anything off it, even if they're not paying you rent. And the number of airlines that have started there and had very successful 24, 36 months run and then imploded is pretty high. Um, the market is less of a centrally planned economy than a series of very independent regions in the country. And depending upon how well choreographed that is, you might get a very positive result, or you might get a very chaotic result. So India is going to flourish over time, especially as trade flows go in there, and air transportation is such a vital ingredient to trade. But I think it's going to be a little bit more protracted than some of the optimists think. We've been here before with a number of wildly optimistic forecasts. Indigo has kind of defied the odds and been very successful.
Mm-hmm.
But the Jet Airways, SpiceJet, Go Air, Kingfisher, I mean, there's a lot of collateral damage. And Air India, a very proud entity for the Tata Group, um, will be one to watch. It's been probably in business since 1945 or something, probably one of the longest standing airlines on the globe. I may be wrong at 45, but it goes back decades. Um, but yet it hasn't reached the top 20 standard that you would have thought for an airline of that size. And so perhaps the current management structure and the discipline to order new airplanes and insert new technology will prevail. But it's been a roadmap that's been a little rocky. And you won't have to make too many phone calls to lessors to find out somebody who's got a horror story about having done business in India.
Yeah.
And you can call those same lessors and say, okay, tell me a story like that in any other country. And they go, well, there's nothing really like that except maybe Brazil. And
Yeah,
it's
that's
just
true. Yeah.
very, very difficult um, to have the laws and the rules of the road universally enforced. And, if you have somebody not paying you rent and they can go in and move your weather radar off your airplane to somebody else's airplane because they think it's their property, it's kind of a bizarre understanding of what that lease contract was all about. I can assure you, when they signed the lease, they never said, by the way, if we don't pay you rent, would it be okay to steal your weather radar? But at the end of the day, they didn't have money, they didn't have inventory, and they needed a weather radar. So what'd they do? Took it off the airplane that was parked. So I guess on a 1 to 10, I'm a 5 on India.
Yeah.
I just think it's going to be a little choppy, but I don't doubt that the potential's there. But the potential's been there for going on 30, 40 years.
I
Yeah.
mean,
I think it's been
there's a
there ever since I
quote.
started.
There's a quote that I was read. This was during a history course I took years ago, where they said China is the burgeoning empire. This will be the world's greatest economy. It's the giant, the sleeping giant that is about to be awakened. If we can penetrate that market, it will be everything. And they were talking about whale oil in the 1800s. And it took another 100 years before that ever came to be. They were correct. They were just wrong for a century before that happened. And that's how India feels. The potential is there. How long does that take to be unlocked? It's a very different market. You don't have the controls that, say, China has over their market. But the potential's still there. I I'm in conflict with that. There's massive potential, but when will it be kind of unleashed?
Yeah.
Yeah, Courtney, I think one of the most misleading analysis is to look at the population of India and use that as a predictor for air travel. I mean, there's a decided amount of the population that really isn't likely in our lifetime to be eligible to travel with their aggregate disposable income.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're going to have to really lift up a lot of the population to give them a disposable income that makes them air travel eligible. Because if you only have a slice of the population that really has the income to travel, it's going to really curtail what the growth potential could be. And so they're going to have to lift everyone up in order to achieve some of the numbers they're thinking about. Can they do it? Absolutely. Will they do it? Time will tell.
Yeah, from a GDP standpoint, they're still doing well, but what India really differs from well, like Brazil and China as well, is just in geography. There is a very robust travel network in India, and it's by train. Mexico has this in buses, believe it or not, and it's amazing. It's a very robust network. People travel in India; they travel by train, and that the value of an aircraft to overcome geographic challenges, say Hong Kong or Panama is a great example, doesn't really exist in India. So those people will travel. They won't necessarily travel on aircraft at the same rates. Certainly not domestically. But then again, there's 1.5 billion of them. And when you aggregate all of the GDP, even across those 1.5 billion people, and consider how much traffic that country is moving today, particularly long haul wide body, I think Air India with Tata, I think that's the right recipe. I think India and Air India and Tata flying the Indian flag know that Indian passengers should be flying on Indian aircraft, rather than, say, Middle Eastern aircraft. And they're going after that. And I think they can take some of that. I think they can take a lot of it, actually, especially with access to Russia, for sure.
Interesting. So one thing I'd love to get your thoughts on, when we having spent close to 30 years at an OEM, I know one of the challenges that the industry faces today is kind of the loss of what we call brain trust, right? Which is kind of a lot of folks during COVID retired that had lots of years of experience, and so we're going into a phase now where that experience just isn't there. It doesn't mean that we don't have bright people working for OEM suppliers, you name it, but the experience is still not there. And so I guess from your side, having worked for an OEM for 30 years, how do you see that kind of impacting the future of building, whether it's airplanes or engines or going forward, right? Because it's true. Where does that? How do you regain that experience aside from just time, right? What are your thoughts there?
It's a great question, and it's one that I've pondered a fair amount. It's awfully easy as an old geezer to say, if we were still around, none of these things would have happened. I'm not certain that's borne out by the facts or borne out by the data, but it's
Yeah.
certainly it's a perception that I could see how some people could draw. Um, I think the discombobulation of the factories by telling everybody to go home and then telling everybody to come back creates enormous stress on these enterprises, and you get people out of position. You get your second baseman playing left field, and you get your catcher being a relief pitcher, and so the difficulty is also not only in the experience people have, but having the right people in the right positions where they can really perform. And I think spooling back up, you don't get a uniform withdrawal of, you get 10% of the people in this category and 10% here, and you get every category. It turns out you lost 65% of your people in this category and 5% of your people here. And so you have to deal with the rebalancing the skills and creating opportunities for the people that haven't had these experiences to go through them. And I think the new world is a much more regulatory strict than it might have been in the world that some of us went through pre-COVID. And I don't know that that's bad. I just think it's different. There was a lot of designated engineering representatives at Boeing when we were building airplanes that, and I'm sure Airbus had an equivalent number, where the latitude given to that responsibility was quite high, and those people all took that responsibility. And now the amount of delegated authority is probably a fifth of what it was before. It's appreciably less, and so it slows down their ability to move through things. And it's convenient to say because experience isn't there, but I think it's just a different regulatory world today. And so they're kind of, punching with one hand tied behind their back, and maybe for good reasons. I mean, I'm not criticizing the FAA, but I can cite quite a few examples of when people say, we used to be able to do it this way, but now we have to do it this way, and it's adding 2 weeks or adding 3 weeks. And more people doesn't necessarily fix that, or more experience. And I don't know whether the regulators will be able to get, at least in this country, congressional support to transfer some of that authority back to the OEMs, even if they earned it because of the scrutiny that Congress puts the FAA under. So living in this new world, and it'd be possible not to equate it to some of the MAX events, is changing the whole landscape. It's just the way we're going to have to proceed. And so I think the launching of a new airplane program creates a wealth of opportunities for people to get new experience and to learn and to grow. So I would hope that happens in the near term. I mean, I know that a moonshot isn't on the near-term playbook for Airbus or Boeing, but I think pushing the envelope and doing an all-new airplane certainly before the year 2030 is essential for our industry to retain the talent and to meet the goals we've set for ourselves in terms of carbon neutrality. And I think the customers will demand it. So I'm optimistic that as the balance sheets get repaired, that you're going to see a different perspective. It doesn't take that many years of very good results before you say, I think we can afford to do this. But honestly, and I'm being a little long-winded, I apologize, the length of time to go to market with an all-new airplane is probably doubled. The duration, if you go and look at a chart of how long it took between the first flight of the A320 and the first delivery and the first flight of the 777 and the delivery, and you compare that now to the A380 or the 777X, I think it's like twice. I mean, it's astronomically larger.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, I mean, and I'm wondering, so obviously the regulators and the certification process definitely has been slowed down, over the last couple of years, but is it just, do you think that's happening because we're the customers ultimately, airlines and the consumer are expecting, aircraft to do so much more, right? So there's so much more technology that's being put into these. There's so much more, things that need to be done that's why it's taking longer. And so you just need to kind of, as an industry, just cope with that and just kind of go, yeah, it will take longer. And so we have to plan, farther out because of everything that everybody wants these things to do. We can't do everything all the time within a shorter, amount of time. Right. So I don't know, if that's because of that, or is it just coincidental based on kind of where we've been in the cycles when some of these airplanes have come out.
Well, I think anytime you take a function and you put more responsibility in the civil service sector, you're going to find a productivity difference. They tend to work 8 to 5 schedules, and 5 o'clock really means 5 o'clock. If you're working for an OEM and you're waiting for some task to get done to get it approved, well, the guys stick around and work overtime for an hour or two, and then you get it approved and off you go. And today you work in an environment that if it doesn't get done to that work schedule, it's come back tomorrow. And so I think you probably were able to have a little bit more flexibility, a little more operational capability when those responsibilities were designated to the OEM. And, I think the safety statistics would bear out that, that we ran a pretty safe operation. So it wasn't any telling, but, you have a sea change and they put more responsibility in the hands of the regulator, and the regulator maybe not as staffed as well as they'd like to be because there's budget constraints in their own organization. And so the workflow tends to get dragged out. And, they showed up at 8 o'clock, but you weren't ready to present it to them till like 4 o'clock. The regulator may say, I'll see you tomorrow. Where if, it's your own designated engineering representative, they're probably still there, even though it's not ready exactly when you said, but it gets done in a little bit more expeditious time frame. I'm not the expert on that, so I'm sure there's much more qualified people, but I do feel it's certainly been a factor on why things are taking longer today than before.
Do you think, John, that the smaller players, Jet Zero, Universal Hydrogen, Amp Air, even the eVTOL players, do they have an advantage in their ability to overcome that? Or is that going to... Are they not fully appreciating how challenging that process is going to be?
Well, Courtney, just look at the politics of getting an FAA administrator approved. I mean, here's one of the most important jobs in the entire aviation industry. And we went months with somebody who couldn't get approved in Congress. And then finally, very qualified person, said, look, I'm not getting approved. I'll move on. And you would have thought in a organized democracy that we'd say this is a really important position. There's a lot of really qualified people. Let's get somebody. But somebody's got a political agenda, so they slow it down. And I mean, it's not aviation alone. Heck, we couldn't pick a speaker for 3 weeks. I mean, there's a lot of other agendas that are complicating just the execution of business. And that's the political world we live in today. And if you would have gone back 5 or 10 years and said, okay, what's the probability that we'd go X period of time before we get FAA administrator? It's impossible. Never happened. We'll be done tomorrow. Or we won't have a speaker for 3 weeks. That's impossible. We'll have one this afternoon. So things that we had taken for granted that have moved fairly expeditiously now get derailed for reasons that aren't really reflective of what you're asking them to do. It's somebody else has another agenda, and they're using this as a way to hold down the process. It's frustrating, but that's the world we live in.
So we don't expect to see you as FAA administrator anytime soon? Is that what you're saying?
I'm an optimist. I think things will get better. It just happens to be a phase that we're going through.
Yeah.
And hopefully the electorate, decides to vote for people that we're going to get along and get stuff done, and not vote for people that want to be obstructionists and say, look, I'd rather shut it down than get something done. It's a very difficult concept to get your head around, that you'd rather do nothing than do something.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, the comment that you made about, I think things would have been different if some of the folks that didn't have 30 years or 40 years of experience retired. You retired from Boeing in 2008, right?
Correct.
And I'm trying to think if we think back over the last 15 years, it's been a pretty rocky road. So it might be coincidental, but
Trust me, they threw a
I
party
don't
when
know.
I left.
It might be, but I think the timing.
They were happy to see me go, so I think they're still partying from.
They're still
I
holding
offered to
it.
come back, and they said we'll get back to you, and my phone hasn't rang since. So they're doing fine. They got some really bright, talented people there, and I'm really proud of them. So they'll do great.
Well, that's great. That's great. So you've kind of moved to a couple of different positions, after Boeing. But I'd love to hear maybe a little bit more about kind of what you guys do at SplitRock in terms of what you've been involved in for the last few years. I think you guys are more on the advisory side, but I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on what you guys do there and what you offer the industry.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm blessed to have some really cool partners that I work with. Two of them, Todd Woodward and Andy Mansell. We worked together at Aviation Capital Group in Newport Beach. Andy kind of ran the placement side, and Todd went through the accounting and strategic initiative side. And we had, quite a bit of familiarity, worked together for almost a decade. And then two of our friends from a company called RW Pressbridge, Clay Smith and Steve Wheelo, who had worked with ACG, were also interested. They bring a very impressive record of investment banking. And so we had this maybe overly grandiose vision that we could bring investment banking and advisory together. And so we could raise money for people that wanted to acquire 20 to $150 million at a time in the aviation space to either buy portfolios or buy equipment. One of our customers has been taking apart engines and parting out engines and doing that quite successfully. And, in our short time together, we're probably between 350 and $400 million of capital we've raised. And we've managed to find clients in Europe, a low-cost airline, a startup airline in the Caribbean, a cargo airline based here in Seattle, my friends at L3. So we've had a kind of a menagerie of different people that said, "Hey, can you take this project on, or will you be available?" And so most of the people that we worked with have continued to pay us and say, "We want you guys to stick around." And raising money when you don't have a balance sheet, if you're competing with the Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan or Deutsche Bank, you're not going to get the mandates where somebody wants to raise $1 billion. You're not going to get a phone call. You're just not relevant in that scene. But for projects that are a little bit more bite-sized, we can bring our expertise and marry up. We probably have a list of 100, 125 investors that like aviation. We're working with a client that's going to decide next week whether they're going to make their first aviation investment. And so, it's kind of fun to bring new people into the space and connect parties together. I've been very, very impressed with the depth that the private equity and the family offices go through on aviation. I mean, you would be thinking you're being interrogated by one of the most experienced appraisers. What about this? What about that? What happens if this default happens? How do you handle this? And the questions are all quite logical, and they're thoughtful. And so it's a fun experience to see how other people view our space as they come into it. And it's a small virtual company. We don't have a corporate office, but we've done satisfactorily well. I don't think we're a threat to anyone. We tend to hope we leave a smile with our customers, and they value the service we bring. But there's many, many people that are capable of providing services in this area. So we work around to find the jobs that we can get, and if we're fortunate to be selected, we do the best we can.
John, from Dial-A-Ride to Douglas to Boeing to
Courtney, if I had been smart, the Dial-A-Ride was basically an Uber platform.
Uber. I know. That's what I was thinking.
It was back in Orange County, California, and the general manager of the Orange County Transit District had a number of people with disabilities and other difficulties getting on and off buses. And he said, why can't we bring, at the time it wasn't called artificial intelligence, but it was, a computer network together to match up where people want to go. And we'll use the county funds to acquire some vehicles. And if necessary, we'll tie into the cabs. And we didn't have phones at the time. And I think the secret sauce for Uber is the telephone, because it gave them all the data on routes and paths and traffic and a whole bunch of things that just weren't available at the time. But we were writing computer algorithms to try and put together a network that would allow a driver that might pick you up and Garrick up on the way to someplace, and so you wouldn't necessarily have an exclusive ride, but you'd have a ride that was more convenient than you could achieve on a bus, and you couldn't really get out of your house for one reason or another and get to the bus stop in a timely manner. So it was a learning experience just a little bit before its time.
But consider your legacy here, John. You made Uber before Uber, and your departure from Boeing ruined the company. I mean, what a legacy. That's impressive.
I've been so lucky to work around really talented, smart people. A guy like Alan Mullally, he still takes my silly emails today and responds to them. And, he's an incredible leader, did amazing things with the 777 program, and had the faith in us to do the 7E7, which later became the 787 program. And I'm guessing that when all the dust settles, the 787 may well be the most successful wide body in the history of aviation, at least between now and 2040. And you're around airline executives, Bob Crandall and Herb Kelleher, and I could go on and not slight anybody. And you work with so many really intelligent people, and you really learn a lot from other people in terms of what their perspectives are. And so I've just been very fortunate to be in situations where I got to meet some really cool people, and I've had a great time doing it. So I'm not certain that Boeing's worse off with me not being there, but I can assure you I'm better off for having been at Boeing.
God, you should run for office. That was well said.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, I mean,
and one other tidbit is when I went to join ACG, one of the assignments that Steve Hannes had for me, a wonderful man, was, okay, you're going to buy some Airbus airplanes. And I said, Steve, I'm not certain that that's really a great idea. Maybe you should have somebody on the team. No, you should do this. And so the Airbus team couldn't have been more open. They didn't spend a lot of time second guessing, whether you're going to be leaking this data to Boeing or you're going to be doing this or that. I mean, I think they were smart enough to figure out that anything they tell me, Boeing probably already knew anyhow. And the Boeing people never once asked me, what about this or what about that? The Airbus approach was remarkably familiar to it was a very similar process. Many of the Airbus folks are still friends of mine today. I was sending a WhatsApp to one of my buddies at Airbus who just had his hip replaced. And, when I was over in Paris for the air show, I caught up with my Airbus friends for a lunch around the Eiffel Tower. So I think the fun part of retiring from Boeing and joining a leasing company was get to interact with some people that you probably wouldn't have been able to interact with, and had as much opportunity to get to know some really cool people. So I enjoyed that part of it.
Yeah. Well, I will say, I think the think the advisory side, and it's the same thing on the appraisal side, is that's the benefit of what we do, is because you are able to interact with all facets of aviation, right? It's not just, oh, you know what, I make airplanes or I lease airplanes or, and yeah, this industry is definitely, fascinating. And the recurring message that, we always get, obviously from all of our guests, it's all about the people, and it just keeps coming across over and over again. So, but look, John, we've taken up, plenty of your time. So this has been like really, really fun. I mean, you got such great experience. You're really easy to talk to, and we certainly love chatting with you any chance we get. So we want to kind of thank you for taking the time to talk to us today and joke around about a few things as well. But it's definitely been a pleasure. So we appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it. You and Courtney, you made this fun. And if you want to go to the cutting room floor and cut out half of it, you won't hurt my feelings. But thanks again for letting me participate.
Don't worry, we won't.
Oh, I will. It just won't be your half that we cut.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What the old man just happened?
I know. Yeah, these are my my reading glasses.
You have reading glasses?
I have reading glasses now. Yeah.
This podcast is over.
What's going on?
It's not reading glasses you need. It's a hearing aid.